Number 1. Charles Taylor. He wore fine suits, spoke with a calm authority, and once stood before world leaders as the president of a nation. But behind the podium and past the cameras, Charles Taylor was orchestrating something so brutal, so harrowing, that it would eventually make him the first African head of state convicted for crimes against humanity. His rise to power was charismatic. His fall was historic. Charles MacArthur Genke Taylor was born in Liberia in 1948. He studied in the United States, attending Bentley College in Massachusetts, and for a time he seemed like someone on the path toward respected public service. After returning to Liberia, he entered government during the administration of President Samuel Doe. Taylor was appointed to head the General Services Agency, a role that gave him power over government procurement and contracts, but it didn't last. In 1983, he was accused of embezzling nearly $1 million and fled to the United States, where he was arrested and held in a Massachusetts jail pending extradition. Then, in a stunning twist, Taylor escaped custody. He vanished and resurfaced in West Africa with a vengeance. Imagine a man who once sat in government offices now rallying forces in the forest. That's what Taylor did in 1989. He returned to Liberia with a militia called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL. Their goal: overthrow Samuel Doe. What began as a rebellion spiraled into a civil war that ripped the country apart. But Taylor's reach didn't stop at his own borders. In neighboring Sierra Leone, a rebel group called the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, had begun waging its own civil war. They were infamous for their tactics, terrorizing villages, using child soldiers, and forcing civilians into labor in diamond mines. The diamonds were used to fund weapons and war, the so-called blood diamonds. And according to prosecutors years later, Charles Taylor didn't just know what the RUF was doing. He was helping them. Between 1991 and 2002, the civil war in Sierra Leone left an estimated 50,000 people dead. The RUF's attacks included mass killings, abductions, and acts of violence that devastated entire communities. Survivors spoke of losing limbs, homes, and families. Taylor, while still president of Liberia, was accused of supplying arms to the RUF in exchange for diamonds, sustaining one of the most vicious conflicts in modern African history. But how does a sitting president become the subject of an international manhunt? That process began in 2003, with mounting international pressure, and after Taylor was indicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone, he agreed to step down from the presidency under the condition of safe exile. He fled to Nigeria. For a while, it looked like he might avoid justice. But things changed in 2006. Under diplomatic pressure, Nigeria agreed to hand Charles Taylor over. He tried to flee again, this time reportedly, disappearing from his Nigerian residence just before the transfer. But just days later, he was captured trying to cross into Cameroon. From there, he was flown to The Hague, where he would face trial before the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The legal process was long and complex. The trial formally began in 2007 and lasted nearly 5 years. Prosecutors accused Taylor of 11 counts, including acts of terrorism, unlawful killings, and cruel treatment. The court heard from over 100 witnesses. Among them were survivors, former fighters, and UN officials who testified to Taylor's influence over the RUF. The prosecution's case centered on evidence that Taylor had provided arms, training, and encouragement to the rebels, and in return, received diamonds and maintained strategic influence in the region. The defense painted a different picture, that Taylor had been a peacemaker, working behind the scenes to end conflict, and that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on insider testimony. Taylor himself testified for several months, denying all charges and portraying himself as a scapegoat. But the court wasn't convinced. On April 26, 2012, Charles Taylor was found guilty on all 11 counts. The court determined he had aided and abetted some of the most horrific crimes committed during the Sierra Leone conflict, including acts committed against civilians and children. A month later, in May 2012, Taylor was sentenced to 50 years in prison. He was 64 years old. He was transferred to the United Kingdom to serve his sentence in a high-security facility. Imagine that. A man once seen as a national leader, now behind bars in a foreign prison. He remains incarcerated today, with no possibility of early release. His appeals were denied. As of 2025, Taylor continues to serve his sentence in the UK, and yet his name is still spoken across West Africa, in history books, in survivor testimonies, and in debates about justice and power. His conviction marked a global milestone. The first time a former African president had been held personally responsible for atrocities through an international court. It set a precedent and sent a signal. Because in the end, the story of Charles Taylor isn't just about one man. It's about what happens when power is left unchecked, when behind-the-scenes deals fuel the suffering of thousands, and when the mask of leadership hides a legacy of devastation. Number 2, Radovan Karadžić. He was a poet, a psychiatrist, and a man who once campaigned on promises of unity. But beneath the public persona, Radovan Karadžić was quietly orchestrating one of the worst episodes of ethnic violence Europe had seen since World War II. His name would become synonymous with genocide, and his face eventually would appear not on campaign posters, but on international wanted lists. Radovan Karadžić was born in Montenegro in 1945, though he rose to prominence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Educated in medicine and psychiatry, he was seen by many as a thoughtful intellectual. In the late 1980s, as Yugoslavia began to fracture along ethnic lines, Karadžić entered politics. By 1992, with Bosnia declaring independence, he emerged as the leader of the Bosnian Serb faction and the self-declared president of Republika Srpska. At first, he portrayed himself as a defender of his people, a man trying to protect Serbian identity in a rapidly changing region. But behind the nationalistic speeches, something much darker was forming. Imagine this. As the international community scrambled to make sense of the war in Bosnia, Karadžić was overseeing a campaign of forced displacement, detention, and destruction. Under his leadership, Bosnian Serb forces targeted Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim communities, executing a systematic campaign of what would later be called ethnic cleansing. Villages were burned, families torn apart, and civilians placed in camps under appalling conditions. One name stands out above all others: Srebrenica. In July 1995, the town of Srebrenica, designated a UN safe zone, fell to Bosnian Serb forces. What followed was chilling. Over the course of several days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from their families, executed, and buried in mass graves. Many of the victims were blindfolded and shot in fields, warehouses, and schools. It was, by any measure, a massacre. And Karadžić was at the very top of the chain of command. Though peace would eventually come to Bosnia in 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Accords, Karadžić went underground. The newly formed International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, established in The Hague, indicted him in 1995. But Karadžić disappeared. For years he evaded capture, reportedly hiding in plain sight, even practicing alternative medicine under a false identity in Serbia. Imagine walking into a wellness clinic and not knowing the man behind the counter had once ordered a genocide. That's how surreal the hunt for Karadžić became. Despite being one of the most wanted men in the world, he managed to evade authorities for over a decade. But in 2008, After 13 years on the run, Karadžić was finally arrested in Belgrade. He was using the name Dragan Dabić and posing as a healer. He had grown a thick beard, changed his appearance, and lived a life far removed from politics until Serbian authorities finally captured him and extradited him to The Hague to face trial. The legal proceedings began in 2009 and lasted nearly 7 years. Karadžić was charged with 11 counts, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic ethnic targeting, forced deportations, and the orchestration of the Srebrenica killings. Witnesses included survivors, former military officials, and UN representatives who had been on the ground during the war. Karadžić, representing himself in court, denied all charges. He insisted he had only acted to protect the Serb people, and that the atrocities had either been exaggerated or carried out without his knowledge. But the evidence was overwhelming. On March 24, 2016, the ICTY found Radovan Karadžić guilty of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was convicted for his role in the Srebrenica massacre, the siege of Sarajevo, and the overall campaign of ethnic persecution. The court sentenced him to 40 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2019, upon appeal, a UN tribunal extended his sentence to life imprisonment, declaring that the original punishment was too lenient considering the scale and gravity of his crimes. Karadžić was transferred to the United Kingdom to serve his sentence in a high-security facility. Today, he remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence for the deaths of thousands and the displacement of hundreds of thousands more. For the survivors and families of victims, his imprisonment brought a measure of justice, though the scars of war are still felt across the region. The legacy of Radovan Karadžić is one of transformation, from soft-spoken intellectual to orchestrator of genocide. His name, once attached to political speeches and public forums, now lives in legal documents, verdicts, and testimonies. And perhaps most haunting of all, his story is a reminder that even those who speak the language of peace can, in time, become architects of horror. Number 3, Hissène Habré. He ruled with absolute power, presenting himself as a strongman defending his nation. But behind closed doors and beneath the surface of his leadership, Hissène Habré was operating one of the most oppressive regimes in modern African history. His presidency, which spanned from 1982 to 1990, would later be described by human rights observers as a brutal dictatorship marked by fear, violence, and silence. And decades later, justice finally caught up to him. Habré was born in 1942 in northern Chad, a region historically marginalized in the country's politics. He was educated in Senegal and France, where he developed a taste for revolutionary ideology and eventually aligned himself with armed movements. In the 1980s, amid regional power struggles and Cold War dynamics, Habré seized control of Chad with backing from Western allies who saw him as a counterweight to Libyan influence in the region. As president, Habré portrayed himself as a stabilizing force, but in reality, he consolidated power through extreme repression. His government established a secret police force, the Directorate of Documentation and Security, known as the DDS. This agency carried out arrests, surveillance, and interrogations, often with no due process. Thousands of Chadians were detained in secret prisons where they were subjected to harsh treatment. Many never returned. Imagine living in a country where any political dissent could result in disappearance. That was life under Habré. The prisons were reportedly overcrowded, filthy, and cruel. Families were left in the dark. Some estimates suggest over 40,000 people were killed during his rule, according to a truth commission established after his fall from power. When Habré was overthrown in 1990, he fled to Senegal, and for a while, it seemed he had escaped accountability. He lived comfortably in Dakar, Senegal's capital, for years. But behind the scenes, victims and human rights groups were gathering evidence and momentum. The push for justice began to grow louder in the early 2000s. Survivors of the DDS began sharing their stories. International advocacy organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Chadian NGOs, compiled testimonies and documents showing the chain of command. Eventually, Senegal agreed to investigate, and in 2013, the Extraordinary African Chambers was established, a special tribunal backed by the African Union and hosted in Senegal to prosecute international crimes committed in Chad during Habré's presidency. The trial began in July 2015. Habré was charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and torture. Some of the charges were tied directly to acts of sexual violence, political repression, and ethnic targeting. Prosecutors presented chilling evidence, handwritten orders from Habré, testimonies from survivors, and reports of systematic abuse inside DDS prisons. Habré refused to participate in the trial and was removed from the courtroom on several occasions. He claimed the court was illegitimate and dismissed the testimonies against him. But the trial continued, with over 90 witnesses taking the stand. Some described being held in cells so crowded they had to sleep sitting up. Others spoke of beatings, starvation, and watching fellow prisoners die without medical care. On May 30, 2016, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Hissène Habré was found guilty on multiple counts, including murder, torture, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to life in prison. The judgment was historic, not just for Chad, but for Africa. It marked the first time an African Union-backed court tried and convicted a former African head of state for human rights violations. The verdict was upheld on appeal in April 2017, and Habré remained imprisoned in Senegal. His health declined in custody, and he died in August 2021, reportedly due to COVID-19 complications. He never expressed remorse. He never acknowledged the pain of the thousands of victims left behind. For those who had suffered under his rule, his conviction was more than symbolic. It was a recognition that the state's violence had not gone unseen, that a man once feared across an entire nation had been made to answer for what happened. Habré's story is a warning that even leaders embraced by foreign powers and praised for their strategic value can leave behind a legacy soaked in suffering. That justice, though delayed, can still arrive, sometimes decades after the crimes. And that silence, once broken, can echo loud enough to bring down a tyrant. Number 4. Moshe Katsav. He was once one of Israel's highest-ranking figures, a man who had climbed the political ladder over decades, ultimately reaching the symbolic peak as the nation's president. But beneath the ceremonial duties and the public appearances, Moshe Katsav was leading a very different life, one that would end in disgrace, criminal conviction, and prison time. His case would go on to shake the foundations of Israeli politics and ignite a nationwide debate about power, accountability, and justice. Moshe Katsav was born in Iran in 1945 and immigrated to Israel as a child with his family. He entered politics young, becoming the mayor of his hometown, Kiryat Malachi, at just 24 years old. From there, he steadily built a career that took him through the Knesset, various ministerial positions, and ultimately to the presidency in 2000. He was considered a consensus figure at the time, a compromise candidate acceptable to both the right and the center. Known for his quiet demeanor and conservative values, Katsav was not seen as a controversial figure until the cracks began to show. It all started in 2006 when Katsav reported to the Attorney General that he was being blackmailed by a former employee. But as investigators dug deeper, the narrative flipped. Multiple women who had worked in his office came forward with disturbing allegations, accusing him of coercion, harassment, and repeated abuse of his position. It wasn't just a single complaint. The accusations spanned years and involved women from different stages of his political career. Imagine the shock. The president of a country being investigated by his own justice system. As the evidence piled up, public pressure grew. By 2007, Moshe Katsav stepped down from the presidency under a plea agreement that would have allowed him to avoid prison time. But the public backlash was swift. Critics argued the deal was too lenient. Eventually, Katsav withdrew from the agreement and chose to fight the charges in court. The trial began in 2009 in the Tel Aviv District Court. The prosecution laid out a pattern of behavior that spanned several years, alleging that Katsav had exploited his authority over vulnerable employees. The testimonies were emotional, often painful, and backed by timelines, call records, and corroborating witnesses. The defense attempted to paint the accusers as unreliable or driven by revenge, but the court wasn't persuaded. In December 2010, the court issued its ruling. Moshe Katsav was found guilty of multiple counts of serious misconduct, including acts committed against women who had worked under him during his time as tourism minister and president. The verdict was clear. Katsav had abused his position in the worst possible way. In March 2011, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, 2 years of probation, and ordered to pay compensation to 2 of his accusers. The sentence was upheld on appeal by Israel's Supreme Court in 2011. He entered prison later that year, becoming the first former Israeli president to serve time behind bars. Katsav served 5 years of his sentence at the Masayahu prison before being granted parole in December 2016. By then, he was in his 70s. His release sparked renewed debate across Israeli society. Some viewed his prison term as a powerful symbol that no one, not even a president, is above the law. Others questioned whether justice had truly been served, especially given the trauma endured by the victims and Katsav's consistent denial of wrongdoing. Throughout his incarceration and afterward, Katsav maintained his innocence. He refused to express remorse or take part in rehabilitation programs, which delayed his parole eligibility. The parole board ultimately approved his release on the condition that he undergo counseling and avoid media engagement. Today, Katsav lives in quiet obscurity, far removed from the ceremonial office he once held. His portrait no longer hangs alongside his predecessors in public buildings. His legacy, once tied to decades of political service, is now defined by the conviction that ended it. The story of Moshe Katsav is not just about personal failure. It's about the impact of unchecked power, about what happens when institutions are challenged not from outside, but from within, and about a justice system that, under pressure and scrutiny, managed to hold even the most powerful to account. Number 5. Rauf Arashukov. He was young, ambitious, and politically well-connected, seen by some as a rising star in Russian politics. But behind the tailored suits and Senate speeches, Rauf Arashukov was hiding a violent past that would eventually unravel in spectacular fashion. His downfall wasn't just a personal tragedy. It revealed deep cracks in a political system where family ties and influence had long shielded those in power from scrutiny. Rauf Arashukov was born in 1986 in the Russian Republic of Karachay-Cherkessia, part of the North Caucasus region. His political ascent began early, thanks in large part to the influence of his father, a wealthy businessman and local political operator. Rauf held several local government roles in his 20s before being appointed to Russia's upper house of parliament, the Federation Council, in 2016. At just 30 years old, he was one of the youngest senators in the country. In public, Arashukov spoke of youth engagement, minority rights, and regional development. He was often featured at public events, projecting the image of a modern, reform-minded official. But beneath the polished exterior, investigators say, Arashukov had been involved in something far more sinister, orchestrating the killings of political rivals. Imagine this: a sitting senator, protected by parliamentary immunity, being directly implicated in contract killings, and no one daring to confront him for years. That changed in January 2019. In an unprecedented moment, Arashukov was arrested during a session of the Federation Council itself. Federal investigators entered the chamber and escorted him out, stunning his colleagues and sending shockwaves through Russia's political establishment. The charges against him were serious. Authorities accused Arashukov of being behind the 2010 assassination of Frau Shebzukov, an advisor to the local leader of Karachay-Cherkessia, and the murder of Aslan Zhukov, a local activist. Both men had been outspoken critics of the Arashukov family's influence in the region. Prosecutors said Rauf had orchestrated the killings to eliminate threats to his power and business interests. What followed was a sweeping investigation that pulled in multiple members of Arashukov's inner circle, including his father, Rauf Arashukov. Authorities uncovered a network of corruption, embezzlement, and organized crime, including the theft of natural gas worth billions of rubles from state energy firms. Wiretaps, phone records, and insider testimony painted a damning picture of how the Arashukovs allegedly operated with impunity for years. The trial began in Moscow in 2021. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented detailed evidence tying Rauf Arashukov to the planning and execution of the two killings. Witnesses testified that he had personally arranged for local gang members to carry out the attacks. The prosecution argued that his political power allowed him to manipulate law enforcement and avoid suspicion for nearly a decade. Arashukov maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that the charges were politically motivated, but the court found the evidence against him compelling and consistent. In December 2022, the Moscow District Court convicted Rauf Arashukov of organizing 2 murders, participation in a criminal enterprise, and multiple counts of fraud and witness tampering. He was sentenced to life in prison, a rare outcome for a high-level Russian official. The court stated that his crimes were not only premeditated and violent, but carried out with full awareness of their consequences and with the intent to silence opposition. His father, Rauf Arashukov, also received a lengthy sentence for his role in the broader criminal scheme. Today, Rauf Arashukov is serving his sentence in a high-security Russian penal colony. The sharp contrast between his polished political image and the brutality of the crimes he was convicted of has left many in the country shaken. His arrest and conviction were widely covered in Russian media as an example, however rare, of the justice system piercing through layers of political protection. The story of Rauf Arashukov is a reminder that power, when left unchecked, can mask even the darkest intentions. And sometimes it takes a dramatic break in tradition, like arresting a senator in parliament, to pull the curtain back on what's really happening behind the scenes. Number 6. Mario Villanueva, Madrid. He was once the governor of a tourist paradise, shaking hands with diplomats and overseeing booming development along Mexico's Caribbean coast. But behind the polished smile and political speeches, Mario Villanueva Madrid was deeply entangled with one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. His story is one of transformation, from respected politician to convicted cartel collaborator, and his case would become one of Mexico's most high-profile political scandals. Mario Villanueva was born in 1948 in Chetumal, the capital of Quintana Roo. He rose through Mexico's long-dominant Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, and in 1993, he was elected governor of Quintana Roo, a state known internationally for cities like Cancun and Playa del Carmen. At the time, the region was experiencing rapid growth in tourism and infrastructure. Villanueva positioned himself as a modernizer, someone who would lead the state into the global economy. But as the years went on, rumors began to swirl. Whispers of strange meetings, unexplained money, and political protection for criminal groups. By the late 1990s, federal investigators had begun to look more closely at Villanueva's administration, and what they found was alarming. According to court documents and investigative reports, Mario Villanueva had spent much of his governorship working with the Juarez cartel, one of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organizations. Prosecutors later revealed that from at least 1994 to 1999, he had accepted millions of dollars in bribes in exchange for providing safe passage for cocaine shipments through Quintana Roo. The drugs were flown in from South America and then transported through Mexico into the United States. Imagine living in a state where the very person in charge of enforcing the law was also working with traffickers to bypass it. That's what was happening under Villanueva's watch, and when the allegations became too serious to ignore, he disappeared. In 1999, just days before his term ended, Mario Villanueva vanished. Authorities launched a manhunt. For over 2 years, he was a fugitive, living under false identities and moving between cities. He was finally captured in 2001 by Mexican federal agents in Cancun, but his legal troubles were just beginning. Initially, Villanueva was charged in Mexico with money laundering and organized crime. He was convicted and sentenced to several years in a Mexican prison. But the United States had also built a case. In 2007, while he was still incarcerated, the U.S. requested his extradition. After legal delays, Villanueva was handed over to American authorities in 2010. He appeared in a U.S. federal court in New York in 2012 and pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had taken millions in bribes, some of which had been moved through American banks. In 2013, he was sentenced to 11 years in U.S. prison. The court noted that his cooperation with cartel activity had undermined public trust and facilitated the flow of narcotics that had devastated communities far beyond Mexico. Villanueva served part of his sentence in a federal prison before being returned to Mexico in 2017. He was briefly held by Mexican authorities and then transferred to house arrest due to declining health. By then, he was nearly 70 years old and suffering from multiple medical conditions. Today, Mario Villanueva is no longer in prison, but his political career is irrevocably tarnished. His legacy is a cautionary tale of how corruption at the highest levels can aid the very criminal networks the public expects politicians to fight. His case also sparked conversations about the blurred lines between politics and organized crime in regions where cartels hold enormous influence. For years, Villanueva was seen as a leader helping his state prosper. But as investigators later revealed, that prosperity came with a cost. The question that continues to echo is how many others in power turned a blind eye, knowing that the drugs moved freely, the money flowed quietly, and the man at the top had opened the gates. Number 7, Robert Telles. He was a local official with a polished image, a rising figure in county politics, and a man who often spoke about public service and transparency. But beneath the surface, Robert Telles was harboring resentment, bitterness, and a growing sense that his image was being torn apart. What began as a reputation scandal would escalate into one of the most shocking crimes in recent Las Vegas history, one that ended not with a resignation, but a prison sentence for murder. Robert Telles served as the public administrator for Clark County, Nevada, a role that placed him in charge of handling the estates of residents who passed away without next of kin. It was a position that didn't often make headlines, until Telles brought attention to it in all the wrong ways. In 2020, local investigative reporter Jeff German, a veteran journalist with the Las Vegas Review-Journal, began publishing stories about dysfunction within Tellez' office. German's reporting described a hostile workplace environment, allegations of bullying, mismanagement, and favoritism. The stories sparked an internal county investigation, which confirmed many of the concerns raised by employees. As the articles continued to surface, Tellez' public image began to unravel. His political standing weakened, and in June 2022, he lost his bid for re-election in the Democratic primary, largely due to the fallout from German's reporting. But instead of stepping away quietly, Tellez became increasingly volatile. Online, he made veiled remarks criticizing journalists. Offline, colleagues noted his growing frustration. And then, something far worse happened. On September 2, 2022, Jeff German was found dead outside his home. He had suffered multiple stab wounds. The attack shocked the community. German was well known in Las Vegas, not just for his recent work, but for decades of investigative journalism. His death prompted an immediate outcry and a high-priority homicide investigation. Detectives began combing through surveillance footage, neighborhood security cameras, and cell phone data. Within days, a suspicious vehicle, a maroon GMC Denali, was linked to the crime scene. That vehicle was registered to Robert Tellez. Police conducted a search of his home and found blood-stained clothing, matching shoes, and DNA evidence tying him to the scene. The arrest stunned the city. A sitting public official, accused of killing a journalist who had exposed his misconduct. On September 7, 2022, Tellez was arrested and charged with open murder with a deadly weapon. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was mounting. The case moved to trial in 2024. Prosecutors argued that the killing was premeditated, pointing to surveillance footage of a man matching Tellez's build and attire near German's home on the day of the attack. The knife used in the crime was never recovered, but forensic experts presented DNA evidence placing Tellez at the scene. Text messages and online activity showed his ongoing obsession with German's reporting. During the trial, Tellez's defense attempted to cast doubt on the timeline and questioned the strength of the forensic links, but the jury was unconvinced. In October 2024, Robert Tellez was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge cited the premeditated nature of the attack and the victim's role as a journalist in determining sentencing. Tellez was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. However, due to sentencing enhancements related to the use of a deadly weapon and the targeting of a public figure, he will not be eligible for parole until serving a minimum of 28 years. He now sits in a Nevada state prison, his political career gone, and his name etched into one of the most disturbing cases of press retaliation in recent U.S. history. Jeff German, the journalist he targeted, is remembered as a relentless investigator who spent his career holding the powerful accountable. The case of Robert Tellez is a reminder that political pressure, when left to fester in the wrong hands, can turn dangerously personal, and that the work of a single journalist doing their job can expose more than just corruption. It can reveal the lengths someone might go to silence the truth. Number 8, Andal Ampatuan Jr. He was a powerful mayor from a political dynasty that controlled an entire province, a man whose family's influence stretched into every corner of local government. But Andal Ampatuan Jr. wasn't remembered for infrastructure projects or civic improvements. He became internationally known for something else entirely: the deadliest election-related attack in modern history. And when the truth came out, it shocked even a nation familiar with political violence. Andal Ampatuan Jr. was the mayor of Datu Unsay, a town in the southern Philippine province of Maguindanao. His father, Andal Ampatuan Sr., was the longtime governor. Together, they ruled Maguindanao like a personal kingdom, commanding private armies, amassing wealth, and silencing opposition. The Ampatuans were part of a political alliance with then-President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, and for years they operated with little interference from Manila. But everything began to unravel in 2009. That year, Ismail Toto Mangudadatu, a political rival from another local clan, announced that he would challenge the Ampatuans for the governorship in the upcoming election. The announcement threatened to break the family's grip on power. Tensions grew. Threats were exchanged. And then, on November 23, 2009, something unthinkable happened. Mangudadatu's wife, along with his sisters, lawyers, supporters, and 32 journalists, set out in a convoy to file his certificate of candidacy. They were unarmed. It was supposed to be a routine political event, but the convoy never made it. On a remote hilltop near the town of Ampatuan, the group was ambushed. Imagine the scene. Vehicles stopped in their tracks, passengers pulled out, phones silenced, and then nothing but chaos. Armed men, later identified as part of a private militia loyal to the Ampatuan family, carried out a massacre that left 57 people dead. Many were buried in hastily dug graves using a government-owned backhoe. Some of the victims had no connection to politics. They were simply journalists covering the story. Shock spread across the Philippines. International news outlets began reporting what would soon be known as the Maguindanao Massacre. The brutality, the number of victims, and the direct involvement of a political clan made it one of the darkest chapters in the country's modern history. And at the center of it all stood Andal Ampatuan Jr. Within days, he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The government declared martial law in Maguindanao. Weapons caches were discovered on Ampatuan properties. And slowly, the picture came into focus. This wasn't just a rogue act. It was a calculated attempt to eliminate political rivals and silence media coverage. The legal process was long and complex. With over 100 suspects and hundreds of witnesses, the trial stretched on for nearly a decade. Families of the victims waited year after year, demanding justice. Delays mounted, defendants changed lawyers, and critics feared the powerful clan would escape punishment through influence or delay. But finally, in December 2019, a verdict was delivered. A Manila court found Andal Ampatuan Jr. guilty of 57 counts of murder. His brother, Zaldi Ampatuan, a former governor, and several other family members and associates were also convicted. Andal Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court found that he had not only participated in planning the attack, but had led the ambush himself. Witnesses testified that he was present at the scene, giving orders to the gunmen. The judgment marked a rare moment of accountability in a country where political killings often go unresolved. Today, Andal Ampatuan Jr. is serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison. The rest of the Ampatuan clan's political influence has largely faded, and their legacy is now tied permanently to the massacre. The Maguindanao Massacre forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about political dynasties, private armies, and the dangers faced by journalists in the Philippines. For years, justice seemed out of reach. But in the end, despite the power he once held, Andal Ampatuan Jr. was brought to answer for the lives lost on that hill. His story is a grim example of how unchecked authority and fear-driven leadership can lead to unspeakable violence. And it remains a haunting reminder that when politics becomes absolute, it can cost not just reputations, but innocent lives. Number 9. Kuldeep Singh Sengar. He was a 4-time elected official from one of India's most populous and politically powerful states, a man who called himself a servant of the people. But the image Kuldeep Singh Sengar presented to the public of a humble representative fighting for his constituents hid a darker reality. His case would grow into one of the most widely followed criminal trials in India's recent history, exposing not just a man, but a system where power could be used to intimidate, silence, and destroy. Kuldeep Singh Sengar was a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, India's ruling party at the time, and served in the Legislative Assembly of Uttar Pradesh. He held sway in the Unnao district, where his influence stretched across government offices, police departments, and community leaders. Locals described him as both feared and respected, a man whose word carried weight and whose name opened doors. But in 2017, a young girl came forward with a devastating accusation. She was just 17 years old when she alleged that Sengar had assaulted her after she went to his home seeking help for a job. According to her, she was lured under false pretenses, and afterward threatened to stay silent. At first, few believed her. After all, she was from a small town, and Sengar was a powerful lawmaker. The local police dismissed her claim, and for nearly a year, the case went nowhere. Then, in April 2018, the story broke into national headlines. In a desperate plea for justice, the girl and her family attempted to stage a public protest outside the chief minister's residence in Lucknow. Just days later, her father was arrested on questionable charges, beaten while in custody, and died in jail. That's when everything changed. The sequence of events was too suspicious to ignore. Journalists, human rights groups, and opposition leaders demanded answers. The Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, India's top investigative agency, took over the case. Soon, new evidence emerged that not only supported the girl's claim, but revealed a web of intimidation, manipulation, and cover-ups involving local authorities who had tried to shield Sengar. The situation escalated further in July 2019, when the girl, her lawyer, and two aunts were involved in a suspicious car crash while traveling to meet legal counsel. Two of the passengers died, and the girl and her lawyer were seriously injured. It was later revealed that a truck involved in the crash had its license plate removed and was traced to a relative of an associate of Sengar. The crash, while never legally ruled an attempt on her life, added a chilling layer to the case. In December 2019, after a lengthy trial held under intense public scrutiny, a Delhi court found Kuldeep Singh Sengar guilty under India's Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. The judge ruled that the victim's testimony was credible and consistent, and that Sengar had used his political power to suppress the truth. He was sentenced to life in prison for the remainder of his natural life. The court also ordered financial compensation for the victim and called out the systematic failures that allowed the case to be buried for so long. In a separate case, Sengar was later sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison for criminal conspiracy in the custodial death of the victim's father. Sengar was expelled from his political party shortly before his conviction, but many critics argued that action came too late. His case became a national flashpoint about justice, political power, and the vulnerability of victims in rural India. The girl, who had risked everything to speak out, became a symbol of resilience for many, though she remained under police protection long after the trial ended. Today, Kuldeep Singh Sengar remains behind bars, serving consecutive sentences for crimes that shook the conscience of a nation. His downfall is often cited as a rare moment where the justice system held someone powerful accountable, but it also served as a stark reminder of how long and how dangerous the road to justice can be. The story of Kuldeep Singh Sengar is not just about a crime. It's about how influence can be used to suppress the powerless, and how a single voice, when brave enough to speak, can crack the walls of impunity, even when the cost is nearly everything. Number 10. Tony Hernández. He wasn't just a congressman. He was the brother of Honduras's sitting president. Tony Hernández once seen as a rising figure within the country's political elite, projected the image of a disciplined lawmaker with access to the highest levels of power. But beneath the surface, he was helping run one of the most brazen and dangerous drug trafficking operations in the Western Hemisphere. His case would become a symbol of how deeply organized crime had penetrated the heart of a nation's leadership. Juan Antonio "Tony" Hernández served as a congressman in the Honduran National Congress from 2014 to 2018. As the younger brother of then-President Juan Orlando Hernández, he enjoyed immense influence in political circles. In public, he was a loyal party member focused on development and security. In private, U.S. prosecutors later revealed he was moving tons of cocaine, laundering drug money, and working hand-in-hand with the very cartels his government claimed to be fighting. The scale of the operation was staggering. According to federal court documents, Tony Hernández was involved in trafficking at least 185 tons of cocaine from Colombia through Honduras and into the United States between 2004 and 2016. He provided cartels with confidential law enforcement information, used heavily armed security teams, and directed shipments using airstrips and ports under political protection. Witnesses testified that he stamped his own initials, TH, on bricks of cocaine. Imagine a high-ranking official who had access to intelligence reports and military coordination, using those very tools to protect and expand a cartel's operation. That's what prosecutors alleged. And the most explosive claim? That the profits from drug trafficking were used at times to fund political campaigns, including that of his brother, the sitting president. Tony Hernández was arrested in Miami in November 2018. His trial began in October 2019 in the U.S. Southern District of New York, a court known for handling international drug cases. During the proceedings, witnesses included former cartel leaders, traffickers, and law enforcement officials. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who operated at the intersection of politics and organized crime, cutting deals with cartels like Sinaloa while shielding himself with his political position. Prosecutors detailed how Hernández had personally accepted millions in bribes, coordinated shipments using military support, and ordered or facilitated multiple acts of violence. One cooperating witness alleged that Hernández arranged for assassinations of rivals. Another claimed that Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán personally handed Hernández $1 million in cash to help fund his brother's political campaign. On October 18, 2019, after less than 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Tony Hernández was convicted on all counts, including conspiracy to import cocaine, possession of firearms, and lying to federal agents. U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman called him a Honduran congressman who used his position of power to operate as a violent, state-sponsored drug trafficker. In March 2021, Hernández was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years. The judge emphasized that he had committed the crimes in conjunction with his brother and other high-ranking officials, and had shown no remorse. He was ordered to forfeit $138.5 million, the estimated profits from his drug trafficking activities. His incarceration marked a turning point in the U.S. government's efforts to expose corruption in Central America. While President Juan Orlando Hernández denied wrongdoing and was not charged at the time of Tony's conviction, the political fallout was immense. In 2022, Juan Orlando Hernández himself was extradited to the United States to face separate drug trafficking charges built in part on testimony connected to his brother's trial. Today, Tony Hernández remains in a U.S. federal penitentiary, serving a life sentence with no chance of parole. His name has become synonymous with narco-politics in Honduras, a cautionary tale of how power, when fused with impunity, can turn a government office into a command center for criminal enterprise. His story is not just about betrayal. It's about how drug trafficking infiltrated the highest offices of an entire country, and how one man's ambition and greed helped fuel a cycle of violence that stretched from rural Honduras to American cities. The legacy he leaves behind is one of broken trust, and a country still reckoning with how deep the damage goes.